So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to welcome you to our online event, A New US President Impacts on the Arab World. Helmut Krieger is a social scientist, researcher, and senior lecturer at the Department of Development Studies at the University of Vienna, as well as a consultant to the VIDC. Helmut, the floor is yours.
Thank you really so much, Michael, and really thank you for all the efforts and all the work you have done to make this event possible. For sure, thanks a lot to the whole VIDC team for facilitating this discussion round. And my special thanks go to Irene Hochak-Boder, Lisa Buchs, and Natalie Luftensteiner, who are doing a really wonderful job to enable our event as well. And for sure, thank you all, our audience, for participating on an empire, a US empire in crisis and possible impacts, a new administration, a new US administration will have on the Arab world, wherever you are now. So good afternoon, good morning. It's my distinct pleasure to chair this discussion round, and we are more than pleased to welcome Rima Majed, Adam Hanieh, and Omar Dahi. Thanks really so much for joining our event, for speaking at our discussion. So, first of all, let me briefly introduce our speakers. And as you can see, an extended version of the biographies of all speakers can be found in the chat. Rima Majed is an assistant professor of sociology at the Sociology, Anthropology and Media Studies Department at AUB, the American University of Beirut. As a political sociologist, her work focuses on the fields of social inequality, social movements, social identity, sectarianism, conflict, and violence, to use quite neutral terms. Really great, Rima, that you can join us from Beirut and will bring in your expertise, your knowledge, your analysis on the situation in Lebanon, as well as on a more regional level. Thank you really so much. Omar Dahi is an associate professor of economics at Hampshire College and research associate at the Political Economy Research Institute, University of Massachusetts, Amherst in the US. Omar also serves as the co-editor of the Issain Chedelier and is a founding member of the Beirut School of Critical Security Studies Working Group at the Arab Council for the Social Sciences. So really absolutely great that you can join our discussion, Omar, and we are absolutely looking forward to your expertise on the war in Syria, its regional ramification. Yes, absolutely great. And Adam Hanieh teaches in the Department of Development Studies at SOAS, the University of London, the School of Oriental and African Studies, with a research focus on the political economy of the Middle East and Palestine. Among numerous publications, just let me mention one, the last one, the most recent book is Money, Markets and Monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Political Economy of the Contemporary Middle East. And I think that is one of the topics you will raise as well in our first and second discussion rounds. So absolutely great that you can join. Thank you really so much. Just a few words about the format of our event. First of all, we will have short inputs from all speakers on two different, but at the same time, interrelated focal points for about 1 hour. And then we will open the floor to questions and comments. So please use the chat for raising your questions and your comments on the different inputs and discussions we will have in the next 60 minutes. Focal points of our webinar are as follows. On the one hand, an US empire in the Arab world and its possible modifications by the new Biden administration, modifications, adaptations, corrections, as you like. And the second focal point is prospects of the revolts and uprisings in the Arab world. For sure, both of them are interrelated as well. Just a few words to these two focal points. For sure, the US elections on the 3rd of November also determined future strategic guidelines of US foreign policy. As a global power, the Arab world is of fundamental importance for the US ever since the end of the Second World War. That was for sure also the case under the US administration of Donald Trump. Represented in very general and very superficial terms, represented as war on terror, all the alliances around Israel and Saudi Arabia should be adapted to a changing and regional environment. So given at the same time the very deep societal, economic and social crisis the US is facing, the question arises what these fault lines of US-American foreign policies in the Arab world will include in the future. That means in particular we will focus on the Israeli occupation of Palestine, a policy of normalization, the war in Syria, its regional global ramification, and for sure the different developments in Lebanon as well. This leads me to the second focal point we'd like to discuss. Over the last years, millions of people, and if I may think about 2011, 2010, 2011, this new cycle of protests, revolts and uprisings in the Arab world. Over the last year as well, millions of people went to the streets in countries such as Lebanon, Iraq, or Sudan to claim fundamental rights. These revolts have for sure also challenged the different regimes, and hence fundamentally questioned existing political, social, and economic power relations in the region as well. How are these protests linked to US foreign policy in the region? How can we understand the different political perspectives these different social movements have developed? In which way do these social movements undermine US policy of normalization between our regimes and Israel, for example? How can we understand their current limitations and contradictions? So these are questions of the second focal point of our discussions. So in that sense, that's it from my side. And I would like to start with the first focal point of US empire, and would like to raise the question to all our speakers: in what way do you expect significant differences by the new US administration's policy in the Arab world? In which way and on which level can we speak about continuities and discontinuities, respectively? So I think let's start in the US, and Omar, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Helmut. And before I share my thoughts, I'd like to start off by thanking you and everyone at the VIDC, and Michael as well, but everyone else who helped put this webinar together. Thank you all for inviting me, and it's really great to be among such a distinguished group. And of course, thanks for the audience for tuning in. And second is to extend my solidarity to Rabab and all our colleagues in Egypt, and join the hundreds and thousands who have called for the immediate release of those recently arrested, and the many others as well. They're in our thoughts. And of course, a big part of why we're here is to try to sort of think about the dynamics of continued authoritarianism and repression in the region, but of course, thinking about the global scale of that as well as the regional scale. Here's hoping for a quick release of those colleagues arrested recently. At any rate, what I have to say, I think, I don't know if it's going to be very coherent, but I'll try my best to contribute my perspective from here in the US. And I think during the election and in the aftermath of the election, of course, there was many dynamics to discuss. But one of the things that really we were waiting to see is to what extent did the dynamics that arose within the Democratic Party will be reflected among the new administration. As you know, and as your audience may know, of course, this year there was a significant rise of a progressive wing of the Democratic Party, manifested by Bernie Sanders, but of course others other than Bernie Sanders. including a new wave of young politicians, but also activists who were also formulating a progressive or left critique of endless wars. Although Trump was voicing that he was going to be reversing endless wars, within the Democratic Party, there was an emphasis on reining back this endless wars, reversing the tide of liberal interventionism that had marked the Democratic Party, of course, since the 90s, and if not earlier, and also reprioritizing away from the military-industrial complex. So there was a lot of anticipation, not just about domestic policy to see where the Biden administration is going, but also on foreign policy. And just yesterday, as I was reviewing my remarks for what I say today, there was several names that were hinted and released as to whom Biden might be choosing for key positions in foreign policy and also in the defense. And the positions that were mentioned were Antony Blinken as Secretary of State, Michel Flournoy as Secretary of Defense, and Jake Sullivan as the National Security Advisor. Of course, Antony Blinken is a longtime Biden advisor, and Michel Flournoy, it's not confirmed yet, but in general, these names, if there was a debate and anticipation as to what direction the Biden administration is going, this is clearly a direction in restoration of the traditional national security state, the traditional liberal interventionist crew that characterized the Obama administration and previously before, which of course Antony Blinken was one of a very active advisor in foreign policy under the Obama administration. Michel Flournoy was and is considered someone with extensive ties to the military-industrial complex, and someone who as her leadership of the Center for New American Security was an advocate for increased military spending, increased projection of US power. So in the sense of asking today what the Biden administration is going to do, it's fair to ask, to what extent did the Trump administration mark continuations as well as departures from the Obama administration before thinking about what changes the Biden administration is going to go towards? And I'll zoom down a little bit and focus on the Syria war, which I'm more the most following the most closely in terms of the regional scale. And I think there's actually something quite remarkable that took place about 10 days ago, which is that the Jim Jeffrey, who is the Syria envoy that was appointed by Trump for Syria and the anti-ISIS campaign, Jim Jeffrey is a longtime diplomat and someone who served under many administrations. He's retiring, and he gave a quite astonishing interview where he basically admitted that he and the US Army, I suppose, had lied to President Trump about the number of troops in Syria. Since, if you recall, in 2019, Trump abruptly mentioned that the US is going to be withdrawing from Syria. And he said, quote, "We were always playing shell games." This is Jim Jeffrey. "We were always playing shell games to not make it clear to our leadership how many troops we had there. The actual number of troops in Northeast Syria is a lot more than the roughly 200 troops Trump initially agreed to leave there in 2019. Now, of course, this kind of declaration made headlines in the US. But another aspect of the interview, which I think is telling about, at least in the case of US Syria policy, is another line in the interview where he basically said that we've put together a stalemate in Syria, and the stalemate is a step forward, and I would advocate it. And here if we want to think about the US Syria policy, we find many continuities from the Trump administration, from the Obama administration, and which is resting on several pillars. The first pillar is the military pillar, which had evolved from a military enabling of regime change, or creating an enabling environment for regime change, if not outright regime change in the traditional sense, but creating an enabling environment through massive financing and training and support program, most famously Timber Sycamore that was run out of Jordan, but also other indirect ways of supporting the Syrian opposition. This evolved in the aftermath of the Russian intervention to a stalemate where the US gained a foothold after the anti-ISIS campaign, and most prominently is located in northeast of Syria, in areas that, according to Trump, we're there to keep the oil. They're in major control of the oil fields. So this evolving military strategy of preventing an outright regime victory, Syrian government victory, along with its allies, while being unable to or unwilling to decisively more engage militarily, is one aspect of this policy. And the second aspect of this policy is the sanctions, of course, and this is the one that has taken the most impact and had the most impact, not just in Syria, but regionally. And this, of course, is something that, in the case of Syria, from the perspective of the US, dates back to 1979. The US had sanctions against Syria. They were mainly for geopolitical reasons, under the guise of anti-terrorism. But they were significantly ratcheted up since 2011 and to even a higher degree under the Trump administration. Today, there are over 600 or 700 Syria officials that are under sanctions, and we have multiple layers of sanctions, not just from the US, but also from the European Union. And this use of sanctions, is not just, of course, limited to Syria. As we know, the Trump administration's approach globally was an aggressive use of sanctions. What the Financial Times said in an editorial is weaponizing the status of the US currency as the global currency reserve in waging economic warfare. And we have now a complex system of sanctions globally, such that in dealing with many of the countries that are supposedly under sanctions, there's almost no way to know if companies are fully complying because of the increased complexity and also the multiple layers of supply chains. And I think in those pillars of US foreign policy, while the Biden administration is unlikely to have the same style and approach, I think these are two pillars that are going to be very difficult to change, at least in the short run, early on in the Biden administration with respect to Syria. There's not a lot of clarity as to exactly how they'll engage, but there's a lot of signals that there will be continuities from the Obama administration era, which in some ways, as I mentioned, themselves are continuities in the Trump administration. And so all of that provides a level of uncertainty to what US policy is going to go. And I think the key aspect here is to what extent will the sanctions continue in the absence of a political process, because Trump showed very little interest in a political process, or to what extent will they be used perhaps by the Biden administration as an actual leverage to push the political process on Syria to come to some sort of resolution. And that will be key, of course, because as a result of the war itself and the destruction from the war, as a result of the sanctions, and as a result of course, COVID, the situation in Syria now is absolutely horrific. It's worse now than it's been even during the hardest years of the war in terms of the economic suffering, the food insecurity, the poverty levels are just absolutely devastating. And of course, this is not just in Syria, this is happening elsewhere as well. But I think these are some of the key pillars of the Trump administration era policy. And I think there's a bit of uncertainty given the structural constraints on US power, to what extent there will be radical changes. And I guess this is something that we can discuss today with our colleagues.
Yeah. Thank you really so much for this very sharp and very clear analysis on the issue of Syria as well. When it comes to US foreign policy and the continuities, and as you mentioned, the restoration of the traditional liberal interventionist state, something we had to observe over the last decades. Yes, let us include Rima from Beirut. Rima, how would you like to answer to the question I raised before? Do you see any significant differences?
Well, let me first start by thanking you for the invite and thanking the audience. And I'm really glad to be in the presence of such great panelists. You know, thinking of this question when I got the questions by email, and I was thinking yesterday, and I thought that probably one of the very few events during the week of the US elections that actually got our attention off the US, where the horrible attacks in Vienna. And I thought that this is maybe a good entry point to think about the relationship or the implications of imperialism and U.S. imperialism, and as I'll probably explain in a bit, different imperialisms as well, beyond just the borders of the Middle East, and in terms of thinking about, the clash of different powers and, this breeding of extremism that is taking the shape of, Islamist extremism, and what it means for this whole planet. I mean, it's important for us, of course, and as someone who lives in the Middle East, to think about the implications on the Middle East, but I also think that it's important for us in thinking about the US elections and also trying to understand what might happen or how things might unfold in the Middle East, is to also think about this global system as a global system. And, imperialism, US imperialism does not operate in the Middle East apart from the rest of the world. So what is happening in, Eastern Europe and the Balkans and the African continent and Latin America might, tell us a lot about what might happen in different places. Now, of course, who will be appointed and what are generally their politics towards the Middle East will affect the changes that will happen in the coming month, given that Trump accepts to leave. And, thinking about this, just as Omar was talking, I was thinking about this, this contradiction between a president that praises himself for being non-interventionist outside the US, or at least for not waging a main war outside, is probably the only president in the past century and a half in US history who's seriously put the country on the brink of a civil war. So just thinking about, this relationship with war inside and outside, and what it means to talk about an empire in crisis, because it is actually really an empire in crisis. But I'd like to first start with an invitation. I'm not an IR specialist, but I think just the logic of empire and, capitalism cannot be understood within the limits of the regional or nation states or just regionalism. It's linked with, the relationship with other powers such as China, but also Russia, who has a major role in the region, especially after its intervention in Syria, but also regional imperialisms, if I may call them as such. So Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey mainly, and the different roles they're playing. So I'm not of the opinion that the US policy towards the Middle East is the same regardless of the president. Yes, I think there will be changes. I mean, Trump was clearly a change compared to Obama. And I think that we might see more of a return to more, the more usual diplomatic channels, as Omar was saying, just your typical, neoliberal imperialism. But and I also expect some changes that might have, that will have actually some considerable effects on populations in the region, such as, for example, the Trump administration had ended all aid to the UNRWA, for example. This is one of the things that might be reconsidered. So there will be changes that might have some serious implications, but I also don't think that we can speak of a complete shift. Some of the damage that has, U.S. intervention in the Middle East has always caused damage, but I think Trump specifically has some of the big decisions that were taken are very hard to reverse at this point, like, for example, the move of the embassy to the American embassy to Jerusalem, but also a very, very, there's a clear shift that with the relationship with Israel and the peace agreements that we've seen in the past couple months that are continuing. Just today, we've heard about visits Netanyahu to different, Arab dictators. So these are all changes that are happening very quickly, and it's also important to note that at the end of Trump's term, sanctions that are being, so in Lebanon, for example, I mean, in Lebanon, there's a political deadlock now where we don't have a government, and it doesn't look like there will be one anytime soon. And the sanctions are playing a very important role in internal politics. At a time when the U.S. Or the U.S. embassy in Lebanon is trying to perform, a role of siding with the people against the politicians, right after the August 4 explosion, when Schenker visited Lebanon, he refused, unlike Sarkozy, who sat with the Lebanese political leaders. The Americans refused to meet publicly with any of the leaders, and they said that they met with the opposition leader that they chose and they designated as leaders of the opposition. But we also know that, under the table, these meetings are all happening. And the sanctions that are being put, so the latest sanction on the son-in-law of the president, who is also the president of the Free Patriotic Movement, which is a major ally to Hezbollah, are clearly political sanctions, although it's under the banner of corruption. In this case, it was not even terrorism, but this is clearly to put pressure on Hezbollah. So I think, for people in the region, or at least for where I am, speaking of the role of the U.S. in the region brings to our mind three main things. The first one is Israel's interest, and this is, of course, I mean, so therefore the Palestinian plight remains one of a major concern. And while we might see some a softer approach than the Trump administration, we still don't expect a huge transformation there, and maybe Adam can say a bit more about this. The second thing that comes to our mind, and I think is very present in our political imaginaries, is the Iraq War and its implications in the region in terms of, heightening identity politics and those conflicts, but also the politics of oil, which I think that, again, Adam will say a bit more. And I think the third aspect that to me is very important is that the past 10 years in the region have shown us that US role has mainly been on the side of counter-revolutionary forces. Even in times when they did not back the dictator that was in place, they very quickly backed the other counter-revolution, whether it's like Sisi in Egypt, or the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. So and we have seen this very, very clearly in this more recent, wave of uprisings in Sudan, where we have seen that the declassification from the list of terrorism and the cancellation of Sudan's debt was conditional on a peace agreement with Israel. So it was really a sort of a very overt, like open political coercion and blackmailing at a time when the country is going through a post-revolutionary turmoil. The country is going through one of its worst financial crises, and especially with the pandemic, but also the floods in Sudan. So I mean, this is really what it means to talk about US imperialism in the region. And again, I mean, countries like Lebanon, I think the explosion of August 4 is also a reminder of the deep links between these imperialism, be it US imperialism, but also regional powers and capitalism. And in this case, it was maritime capitalism more clearly, with the story of this ship that was in the port for many years, holding more than 2,700 tons of explosives, with alleged links to Hezbollah, Iran, but also Russia. And then, how did it explode? What is the role of, other powers in the region, and also globally, Israel and the US? This whole struggle we're seeing today of power over the ports in the Mediterranean, and who will control the different ports, a return of the French on the scene, but also a return that is clearly also, being in cooperation with the US. So these are all just signs that show us what a change in the administration in the US might mean, but also what type of continuations we can expect. In the end, it's a struggle of power and interests in the region. So I think one of the main challenges today, I mean, we talk with every elections, it's maybe in the Middle East, people follow previously, not this last one, but usually people in the Middle East follow the US elections maybe more than people in the US. But I think this year is exceptional. Well, first, because we had, it was about whether Trump will stay or not. But also, I think it's going to be different because we're talking about a new administration in the context of a world that is now ruled by a post-truth ideology, where Trump refuses to acknowledge that he's lost the elections. But also, and I think more importantly, we're talking about a world that is still struggling with a global pandemic that has huge implications on economies around the world, and that has huge implications in the Middle East, specifically on the different populations. We're talking in Syria, as Omar mentioned, it's never been that bad. In Lebanon, we are seeing a free fall of the whole financial system. In Sudan, it's the same. I mean, in Iran as well. I mean, Iran is a very important player. So I think that this is going to be an important thing to follow in order to understand, how this how this unipolar world that we talked about post Cold War is now in crisis and transforming, and we're seeing, I think a different shape of geopolitics arising. So I'll stop here and maybe we can continue the discussion with the Q&A.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you really so much for your very clear analysis on what it includes to have an empire, an US empire in crisis, regionally as well as in Lebanon. So let me bring in Adam from SOAS. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Helmut. And I'd like to begin also by echoing my thanks to VIDC and the other two speakers for their very interesting comments. I think they're going to echo a lot of what I have to say as well. And also, I also would like to echo Omar's comments around solidarity to all political prisoners in Egypt at the moment. I think this is very important that we kind of express that kind of solidarity at this moment. I want to focus my comments on some of the points that Rima, I think, very effectively highlighted, in particular the question of Israel and the Gulf states, the GCC states, and what possible impact the transition to the Biden administration might have on the position of Israel and the relationship between Israel and the Gulf moving forward. Because it's very clear, I think, over the last couple of years that there has been a significant reorientation in the region under the Trump administration. We've seen the move, as Rima noted, to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the move of the embassy. We've seen the cutback to the funding of UNRWA and US support for UNRWA. And of course, most recently, the normalization between Israel, the UAE and Bahrain followed, and looking more likely with some announcement around Saudi Arabia, I think, in the near future. Now, these on the surface level, I think, are very significant changes, but I do think it's important to situate, as both the other speakers have done, these moves in the longer term strategic orientation of successive US administrations. I think it's clear historically that the US policy in the region has essentially focused around two main pillars. That is Israel on one side and the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia, on the other. And since, for many decades, but particularly from the 1990s and 2000s, we see an attempt by successive US administrations to basically bring these two pillars together. We can see this clearly with the Oslo Accords through the 1990s, and a main focus of the Oslo Accords was to promote this normalization between Israel and other Arab states, in particular the Gulf. We can also see it under the Bush administration in the early 2000s with the announcement around the new Middle East, the idea of the Middle East Free Trade Alliance, which was supposed to see kind of bilateral agreements between the US, free trade agreements between the US and various Arab states that would then be knitted together regionally. With the overall aim of bringing Israel and the Gulf together within a single economic agreement. Now, those kinds of processes had varying degrees of success, but they never really met any fruition. However, what we can see under the Trump administration is really the acceleration and in many ways the culmination of the logic of strategic US strategic policy in the region over the last few decades, through the 1990s and 2000s. And I think it's really important to see this, not to frame the Trump policy in the region as being somehow an aberration or a break from this longer term orientation of successive administrations. So, you know, I'm sure people listening and participating tonight, we can see the kinds of the things I mentioned at the beginning that really kind of, if you like, culminate in this the normalization between these two historic pillars of US power in the region. Now, I do think it's very important, as Rima pointed out, to situate this moment and this overall strategy within the kind of wider crisis of the global system, in particular the relative decline of US power and the emergence of rival powers, whether it be in China and East Asia, Russia, the kind of break, if you like, from that unipolar moment that we saw from the early 2000s onwards. So I think in that context, within this wider transformation of the global system, the Middle East has a very pivotal role, due partly to the question of oil, which we can talk about more in discussion, but I think even more broadly, there are other aspects to how the Middle East fits into global capitalism, the global financial system, that make the region so central to hegemonic power. And that is why fundamentally we see this US attempt to kind of bring the region under its control through bringing closer together Israel and the Gulf states. So Trump, in a way, as I've said, is a culmination of this, but I do also think we need to recognize that there was many indications prior to the Trump move that indicated both both Israel and the Gulf states were interested in this kind of normalization. We saw the participation of the UAE in military exercises with Israel. We saw numerous reports of Israeli companies participating in selling technology to the Gulf, military technology and surveillance technology to the Gulf. We saw public visits by Saudi retired military personnel to Israel, meeting with political and military officials in Israel. So all of these things happened prior to the Trump administration, but were, if you like, solidified in the Abraham Accords, so-called Abraham Accords, over recent months. So I don't think that the Biden administration and the Democratic Party represent any break with this, precisely because it is in this long continuity with Israeli policy as a whole, with US policy as a whole. Now, I do think, however, that we might see a shift in emphasis in how a US policy plays out. In particular, perhaps a return, in the case of the question of Palestine, a return to these ideas of so-called peace and negotiated settlements, which were so well codified as part of the Oslo Accords. But I do think, as many people have said since the Oslo Accords were signed, that we need to understand these so-called peace agreements. We need to understand these negotiated processes as not representing any substantive resolution or substantive move towards the fulfillment of Palestinian aspirations, but rather as a mechanism to deepen the process of colonization, to deepen Israel's control of Palestinian land and Palestinian population. So I think if we start from that point, understanding Oslo and negotiations as actually being a betrayal of Palestinian aspirations, then it clarifies very much any kind of cosmetic change we might see around a return under a Biden administration to these kinds of negotiations. So that would be the kind of tenor of how I would see Biden in this, in continuity, if you like, again with what Trump has managed to achieve from the perspective of the US. Having said all of that, I can see, it's clear in the last few days, in this kind of twilight of the Trump administration, that the Trump and Pompeo and others are really trying to solidify and accelerate the things they've been able to achieve with these last few days remaining. The visit yesterday reported in the Israeli media of Netanyahu to meet with Mohammed bin Salman in the Neom development is one indication of this. The statements by the US State Department over the last week trying to criminalize and condemn the BDS movement is another example of this. So certainly there's a lot of damage that could still be done in this twilight of the Trump administration. And I do want to also signal, and I think this again echoes what the other two speakers have said. If we think about some of the other differences that we might potentially see beyond the question of Palestine and the Gulf, with a Biden administration, we may see, for example, a different approach around Yemen. At least that's what Biden has said in the lead up to the elections. I'm skeptical again whether that will be a real. I don't think it represents any kind of substantive change towards or to Saudi Arabia, but we may see a more vocal move by the US to bring an end to the war in Yemen. Partly for the reason that they don't see it necessarily as being in their strategic interests. We may also see, some return to discussions with Iran. But again, I don't think this represents a fundamental break in the long-standing US policy against Iran in the region. So to summarize and to finish here, some cosmetic differences, perhaps a difference of emphasis here or there, perhaps more talk about negotiations and discussion, but no real substantive break from what happened under the Trump administration. Thank you.
You're muted, Helmut.
So very sorry, I didn't realize that I have muted myself. Yes, really, Adam, thank you really so much for this very clear analysis on the strategic guidelines of the US in the Arab world, not just today's strategic guidelines, but grown out of the last 70 years, I would say. So maybe we can discuss a bit more about the strategic guidelines and their ramifications, their repercussions regionally, as well as in very specific parts such as Syria and Lebanon as well. If what Trump represents, and as Adam said, a kind of culmination of a US strategic policy in the region, resting on Israel on the one hand and Gulf states on the other hand, and a kind of continuity by the new administration. Also, there might be some adaptations, some different kinds of changes, but in general, a kind of continuity on these strategic guidelines. What does it mean for Lebanon? What does it mean for Syria? What does it mean for the cycles of war? Omar, my question to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's, thank you so much. And thanks to my colleagues. And I think this is really difficult. This is now where we're trying to speculate a little bit. And that's partly because of exactly the dynamics that Rima mentioned, is that there are multiple players. The US is not the only player. And its capacity to shape outcomes is diminishing with the rise of multiple actors, with the rise of not just regional, but internationally, the emerging powers. And I think with respect to Syria, I think part of the debate about Syria is, at least from the US perspective, among those who are thinking about US-Syria policy, despite these continuities, there's a debate as to what extent there are strategic interests of the US in Syria. And if we think back at what the Trump administration has laid out at various times through Pompeo, and it's really been Pompeo and Rayburn and Jim Jeffrey who once Trump makes the declarations of what he wants to do about Syria, but the leading hawk, so to speak, is led by Pompeo itself. And I think they've tried to lay out a Syria policy that is less interested in Syria itself and more interested in pushing back against Iran and against Russia. And it's very clear that when the Trump administration has laid out its conditions, for example, for lifting the sanctions, or conditions for the US possibly leaving Syria, they're all conditions that the Syrian government is incapable of matching, even if it wanted to reform itself suddenly and engage in a meaningful transition, meaningful implementation of the UN Security Council, the 2254, which is the basis of what is the broad parameters of a solution on Syria. I think it's tied to this geopolitical demands of pushing back against Iranian presence as well as Russian presence in Syria. While knowing that that's impossible, while knowing that the US is unable to really ensure or enact a removal or withdrawal of Russian and Iranian troops. And I think one of the things that we've seen as possibilities emerging in the last few months, when the Biden administration, when Biden gearing up to the elections, is what are the possibilities for not a solution for the Syrian crisis, but lessening the really suffocating impact of the sanctions, and the sanctions, of course, coming on the heels of this brutal war and coming on the heels of COVID. And the reason is because there is, to some extent, a fear of state collapse in Syria. Or some sort of outcome that, as a result of the significantly deteriorating economic conditions, would be catastrophic, of course, primarily for Syrians, but would have broader ramifications. And I think here's where potentially there is agency from Europe on this particular issue, given that there, at least in the past months and past year or two, there has been increasing signs of, while maintaining significant sanctions, of trying to find what would the roadmap be for a political solution. And I think what the Biden administration has signaled is potentially agreeing on some sort of roadmap that would improve or that would involve some sort of political transition. Now, the shape of that transition is likely to be much less than the aspirations of many Syrians, particularly of course, in the opposition. But given the balance of power on the ground, and given the realities of the Syrian government recapture of most territory, what would the most meaningful political process mean? And that's why neither the US nor the EU has blocked the work of the Syrian Constitutional Committee, which is meeting periodically in Europe, which has not accomplished anything to date, but which might be a pathway around this issue. At the same time, laying out conditions, for example, for what is, hearkening back to the pillars that Adam mentioned of Israel, what are, for example, acceptable parameters for Iranian troops in terms of geographic location in Syria? How far are they away from the Israeli border and so on? So the Biden administration, at least on that end, while not representing a fundamental shift, has potentially signaled ways where they could potentially explore a more for more strategy, so to speak, that to what extent might there be movement on the humanitarian front and potentially even on reconstruction. I think this policy, unless it's a wholehearted engagement by the Biden administration, which I don't see any reason why they would want it to be, will face lots of obstacles. And that's primarily because the number of actors who have veto power over what's happening in Syria is quite large. And so the dynamics of course, the Gulf interests in pushing back against Iran as well, especially emboldened by the increasing normalization with Israel, means that there's a lot of possibilities for retrenchment that are far significant than the momentum for pushing forward on this track, as needed as it is from a humanitarian perspective.
Yeah. Rima, what do you expect as a kind of repercussion, given what, let's summarize what Adam already mentioned about the strategic guidelines of the US, the two main pillars, Omar's input about a liberal interventionist state in a regional perspective. What do you expect?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Omar that this is probably one of the, it's a difficult question because expectations are we can try to think, but I think, the very fact that in Lebanon, for example, there still is this political deadlock, and that, the prime minister that was ousted last year by the uprising is back, but is back with almost no powers and is unable to really form a government. And this really goes back to this tension mainly between, the US and Iran and Lebanon, and it's mainly the question about what role Iran plays, and how is the US, this new US administration, going to deal with with the Iranian nuclear power? Would they go back to an Obama? Although I don't think this is going to happen. I think at least what we're seeing, and as Adam was saying, what is remaining from Trump's office, Trump being in office, can still have very or really tremendous effects on what is happening in the region. We're seeing how they're moving. Trump is moving really fast with those, either it's sanctions or peace agreements or these. Meetings, and also I think I'm not an expert on that, but I think it's also important to see what is happening in terms of arms trade, since these are things that Biden has mentioned in his campaign, that he's going to, his relationship with Saudi Arabia might be a bit more sour given the human rights record that they have. And so these are all very important bits of the puzzle we're trying to put together. I think another very important role that the US can play in terms of, so I mean, from the vantage point of Lebanon and I think Syria, but also Iraq, I think it's mainly this push against Iranian influence.
It's also a play, I mean, both the Russians and the US administration are playing on those contradictions. You know, the Russians are in a coalition with, or an alliance with the Iranians in Syria, but it's also an alliance that has a lot of internal contradictions. You know, they're friends of Israel. On the other hand, you have the US. So these are all, it's a very complex setting. And I think they will, I mean, empires will play on those contradictions depending on what the interests are. One thing that is relevant to Lebanon and maybe, you know, post-war Syria is the role of the US in facilitating an IMF intervention, you know, but also the role that and I think Europe is also playing an important role in Lebanon, France, and the SEDG conference. You know, and for Europe, maybe because of the question of migration, they have a very direct interest in, you know, finding financial or bringing some financial aid. Of course, that will not destabilize any system. Many of those regimes that are still in place, whether it's in you know, in Syria, but also in Lebanon, are regimes that have really come to an end and that are now just surviving. I mean, in Lebanon, it's clear that the Taif agreement has come to an end. There's a political deadlock that has been, I mean, it's a system that is based on political deadlocks since 2005. And it's clear that after the uprising, there needs to be a big shift. The bigger question in Lebanon is Hezbollah, and it's interesting here again to highlight some of the contradictions between, you know, the relationship of foreign or, you know, European powers, maybe more so than the US, but to a certain extent the US, and the internal popular relationship, whereby, of course, I mean, a lot of people in Lebanon have, you know, have issues with Hezbollah, specifically in terms of their internal politics and, you know, the role they are playing politically, the fact that they have, you know, they have an army that is probably more powerful than the Lebanese army, but also the fact that, you know, economically, this is a party that has supported neoliberal policies from the very beginning. But it's not very widespread to see people very unhappy with the resistance role that Hezbollah plays. Whereas if we look at, you know, the position of the Europeans or to the Americans to a certain extent, there's always this rhetoric of you can be a political party and participate in you know, local politics, but you cannot have that resistance, you know, more armed side. So this is not to say that you know, there aren't other contradictions, but this is just to show how you know, an attack on a certain group is also shaped by what you know, by the interest of those different powers, and you know, do not always match with the aspirations of the people in the region, even if at the surface it looks like, you know, some people are criticizing Hezbollah, and, you know, there's this rhetoric that, I mean, Hezbollah itself uses, that anyone that criticizes it for any reason is, you know, is siding with the empires. But these are contradictions that will, I think, that are important because it will really play an important role in the coming month. We have entered, I think, a period of an open, you know, of an open confrontation. Biden has clearly said that he will not back off on the sanctions on individuals. And these sanctions happen to be, again, as I said before, clearly targeting pro-Hezbollah politicians in Lebanon. I don't think there's any, you know, it's not in defense. I think it's, you know, they have participated, like everyone else who was in power in the past 30 years, in corruption. I just find the fact that the US is imposing sanctions on just one side, so they are playing on the internal divisions in the country, which, you know, in terms of, just to answer the second part of the question, in terms of, you know, what can we expect for these uprisings and how it might unfold. Again, it's complex and it depends on several factors. I mean, there is of course geopolitics, but I think geopolitics is not just top down. Sometimes geopolitics is actually shaped by what happens in the streets. And we have seen American embassies really being silent for a while because they were unsure what position to take. So sometimes, you know, these developments can shape broader positions. But I also think that there are really important internal transformations that are happening in those societies. You know, in Lebanon, we are, for example, now witnessing a wave of, I think it's beyond migration. It's become like a sort of exodus. Everyone is leaving, everyone is trying to leave. You know, stories of people living in the sea are starting to emerge, as in Syria. So again, I mean, these will shape the second phase of. I think it's going to be a very long-term process in terms of change. There's a system. There are many systems and many you know, structures and regimes that have you know, collapsed somehow, although they are still in place. The question now is you know, how are the forces of the counter-revolution, which, you know, the US and other are part of that, are they going to come to their rescue and reinvent them in a new way, which is historically something that has often happened in Lebanon? Or are the forces on the ground of the you know, forces of the opposition, the uprising, will they be able to push for an actual change? And here again, it depends on, you know, how organized these forces are, and how you know, all these details about you know, how a social movement can lead such a huge transition. So I think I've mentioned most. Yeah, just a final point again to reiterate what I started with is those struggles and those uprisings in the region, you know, are partly, at least, if not fully, shaped by these really huge structural transformations. It's a region that has it has the highest rate of youth unemployment in the world. It's a region that is you know, now struggling with you know, one of the highest, again, in rate of inequalities. So these are all things that have not gone away, and therefore that will continue in the period that will come. Does it mean that people will go back to the street next month? I don't know, and I think no one knows. But it means that you know, it's a very fertile soil for you know, for this conflict to continue. And again, this is not a conflict that is only regional. It's a global conflict, from the progressive forces in the US that Omar started, you know, his first intervention by mentioning, to what is happening, you know, almost at every corner of this planet. You know, and the pandemic has opened a new venues for people to think about a transformation. So I think, yes, links and solidarity between all these movements and struggles in different places for more justice and also for liberation are very important for us to be able to imagine an alternative world and you know, move beyond this disaster capitalism. Because again, at a point where we are talking about a very deep financial crisis and also an economic recession, you know, this new US administration might see opportunities, and again, you know, and I hope not, but again, as we were mentioning, I mean, interventions in terms of disaster capitalism and imperialism, or you know, more forces will be able to come together and push for a more just world for everyone. So I'll stop here, and we can maybe talk more in the questions.
Yes, really, thank you so much. And by the way, to all of you, our audience, if you like to raise different questions, if you want to comment on the discussion so far, please use our chat, and that's a very good opportunity to raise questions and to bring in your perspectives into our discussion. Rima, thank you really so much for bringing in the issue of social movements, the issue of uprisings and revolts in the Arab world. And maybe we can try to combine both, as you already mentioned, the issue of structural factors strongly shaping political dimensions of the different social movements is for sure the case. And as we all know, it's a huge task for years to come to fundamentally challenge current basic conditions, not just in the Arab world, but all over the world, more or less. And I would like to combine what Adam mentioned first of the two pillars by the US, by referring to Israel as well as to the GCC, and asking what does this include for a Palestinian struggle? What are the necessary components of Palestinian struggle? And as we all know, the destructive elements the Oslo Accords had on the Palestinian political field. How would you link your analysis on a geopolitical and more political economy level to the issue of protest, uprising, necessities of the different protests when it comes to the Palestinian struggle and its relation regionally?
Yes, thanks, Helmut. Well, I would say, first of all, following on from what I spoke about it initially, that this question of normalization with Israel, and the normalization between Israel and other Arab states, in particular the Gulf, has always been a strategic priority, I think, of the Palestinian movement, resisting this tendency, precisely because of the significance that normalization plays within overall imperial ambitions in the region. So I think the first thing in response to your comment on question is to say resisting that tendency, resisting the normalization, which is not simply political. And I think this is really important to emphasize, that it's also an economic, and perhaps in some ways primarily an economic normalization. So when and we need a lot more kind of work and research into this. When we talk about Israel and the Gulf states, what's this going to mean in terms of economic agreements between these two pillars? What's it going to mean in terms of an Israeli economic presence in the Gulf, or a presence of the Gulf in Israel? What's it going to mean, for example, in the last week or so, we've seen reports in the Israeli press about the UAE investing, for example, in a industrial park, high-tech park in Jerusalem, aimed at Palestinians in Jerusalem, but under the auspices of the Israeli Jerusalem municipality. What kind of normalization, economic forms of normalization are we going to see unfold? So resisting all of these multifaceted tendencies that we can see. The second thing that I would say is really key, and it's again harkens back to a more, to a long-standing element of the Palestinian revolution, which is the importance of the right of return of Palestinian refugees, and continuing to emphasize that the question of Palestine isn't just bartering over slithers of land in the West Bank, which is what Oslo was intended to cast the question of Palestine as. It is also about Palestinians inside, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and it is fundamentally about the return of Palestinians and their descendants expelled from in 1948. So keeping that, I think, as a bedrock principle, this question of the right of return is really key. moving to the other side of your question in regards to what might this mean more in terms of Palestine regionally, I think both these aspects, both the anti-normalization and the question of the right of return, point to the importance of the regional scale at this moment, and that the question of Palestine isn't something that's going to be resolved solely at the level of Palestinian politics. It means confronting the particular hierarchies, unevenness and inequalities that we see regionally, that both Rima and Omar have pointed to. So I think this is something, again, that perhaps has been lost through the experiences of the Oslo years, this kind of narrowing down of the Palestinian vision to simply the sphere of Palestinian politics. But I think looking at how does Palestine fit into the other kind of the other struggles that we have seen in Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, Algeria over the last year, I think is really important. And I would just end by I think reiterating I think a really important point that Rima mentioned now, which is the significance of seeing both the political changes that we've seen in the region, alongside and as part of also the economic transformations, the structural transformations that we've seen over many decades. So when we look at the Arab Revolts of 2010, 2011, we can see this wasn't simply a question of authoritarianism or long-standing dictatorial regimes. It was also very closely wrapped up with the impact of neoliberal change in the region, the fact that neoliberalism both required these authoritarian states to push through measures, but also produced these vast inequalities internal to different countries and across the region. So confronting that kind of combined political economy and seeing, I think that change also requires addressing those socioeconomic differences that we see in the region. And this is true in the case of Palestine as well. One of the effects or one of the realities of the Palestinian Authority today is the significant deepening of inequalities inside Palestinian society. Oslo and normalization with Israel has not been detrimental to all of Palestinian society. There are small, very tiny layer of Palestinians who have benefited from these kinds of processes. So I think seeing that also as part of the renewal of any Palestinian politics is also really important at this moment.
Yes, really, thank you so much. And once again, to our audience, I think it would be absolutely great if you could, if you like to raise the different questions, use our chat. Yes, I think there are already a lot of. The first one by Dominic. About the US policy, shall we expect, in my words now, shall we expect a change concerning the sanctions on Iran when it comes to the Biden administration? And maybe I can extend this question. What would that include regionally? As a first question, who likes to answer this question? I think we have already touched a bit the issue of Iran, and for sure, as we all know, it's a very, very important topic given the presence of different Iranian forces regionally, and for sure, given the geopolitical competition or the systematic escalation of the confrontation dynamics by the US over the last years or so. Who would like to answer? Omar?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. We you know, this goes under the category of we're not quite sure, particularly because of all sorts of constraint, not just you know, the constraints in the region, but also constraints domestically in the US, and the costs of the Biden administration appearing to be soft on Iran. There was a lot of confused and confusing revisionism of the Obama era legacy, so to speak, and a debate about this, not from those who were sympathetic to Trump, but from those who were coming from the traditional security establishment. And there was an open debate, even within that group, about the validity and the engagement with the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal that was signed by the Obama administration. And so I think the Biden administration, while even though I start off by saying they've restored the previous crew, not all of that crew was unified in terms of what should the appropriate policy be towards Iran. And some might actually take advantage of the Trump era, even though they might have disagreed with it, but the ratcheting up to maximum pressure, so to speak, might then provide them with an opportunity to re-enter this negotiation, if at all, from increased leverage perspective, from in the minds of these policymakers. And so there's the capacity to, in the second round, extract more concessions from Iran due to the deteriorating economic conditions of course, in Iran, but also in Iranian allies. And now Iran is having to ship off more and more support for Syria, oil shipments to Syria as well. I think the problem is that as long as these dynamics occur within, quite simply, war by other means. The sanctions are often portrayed as the alternative. We're not escalating in terms of armed, escalating, direct violence. And the sanctions are often promoted as something that is promoting accountability and promoting peaceful transitions or less aggression. But in fact, they're a continuation of war by other means. And this is something that's, widely accepted in IR scholarship. There's, a spectrum between gentle persuasion and armed warfare, and sanctions are coercive measures somewhere on that spectrum. And I think in large part, the actions of the different actors, including Iran, are endogenous to US imperialism, even while they're presented as exogenous to it. They're endogenous to the cycle of confrontation, escalation, siege warfare in many ways that has, and of course, direct military intervention that has marked US foreign policy. And I think one of the things that the Obama administration did in the JCPOA is that it, in many ways, continued the demonization of Iran on all other respects, but said we're gonna, in a very limited way, engage with it in a way that perhaps limits its nuclear deal without changing or even attempting to change the overall politics. Whereas, for example, if you think about what Trump did in North Korea, as much as he was criticized for it, he went directly in an attempt to change the entire politics by meeting with the North Korean leader. That, of course, there's all sorts of ways you can critique with that, but that at least attempted to reframe the entire politics. When you have a demonization of Iran that considers it, that you need to continue this all-around siege warfare against it, and only focuses on the small part of the nuclear agreement without looking at the overall regional picture, I think it's unproductive. I mean, think of the countries that are intervening now. Turkey's intervening in Libya, they're intervening in Syria, they've intervened recently in the Armenian Azerbaijani war. Other regional powers have intervened in Egypt to support the coup, overthrowing Morsi. So Iranian is hardly the only actor that is having a very aggressive regional foreign policy. And this, as long as there is a process whereby this maximum pressure, even if it's softened up by the Biden administration, is pushing in the same direction, I think it's hard to see how these dynamics will change. And in fact, if some of these dynamics hold, others might not, because like all of my colleagues said, the regional powers are much more assertive in terms of their own agency than ever before. And I think that that itself is connected to the question of social movements, because I think there has been positive developments. If I may go back to that question as well, there have been significant positive developments, for example, in Iraq and Lebanon, in the birth of counter-sectarian social movements that have rejected the type of politics that have emerged, particularly the sectarian politics and the system of patron-client relationships that have been engendered underneath that, to a counter-sectarian or cross or national perspective as well. And those are quite important, but at the same time, we also see the fact that you can't divorce the weakening of the states themselves, the destruction of Middle Eastern states as also having an impact, because that has weakened the societies, and even at the human development level, at the food security level, at the basic capacity to survive, at least in the case of Syria, but also elsewhere as well. And then the second aspect of that is that for all the positive trends that we saw in Iraq and in Lebanon, there's also significant contradictions and limitations to solidarities. We see this in Lebanon, we see this in Syria as well, where there's deep splits among Syrian society and a very polarized debate. So I think there's really contradictory dynamics there at the social movements level. And while to some extent you see the spirit of the 2011 protest continuing, I think the fragmentation and the contradictions are also quite present and need some serious grappling with the politics of solidarities, needs serious grappling with the role of various states, but also at the global level, US interventionism in the region.
Yes, Omar, thank you really so much. Unfortunately, I think we are already running out of time, so we can extend our wind for 10 to 15 minutes because we have a lot of questions. But I also would like to bring in Rima, you again, exactly about these contradictions, about the limitations of the different movements. Also, as we could see, or do you like to answer to the question raised before?
I just had a small comment about the question on Iran. I think one important thing to keep in mind is that what the sanctions have done is that they weaken the more centrist reformist line of Rouhani, and they've strengthened internally the more radical lines. And I think given that next year Iran is having presidential elections, I think what the Biden administration would do with Iran would also be shaped by that. So I think it's not just what theoretically how they see things, but it's also about these developments and how they're going to deal with it. So yeah, I think it's going to be a bit different than the Trump administration, but it's also going to be very much shaped in how they will deal with electoral politics and again the internal contradictions in Iran. Yeah, just wanted to note that.
Yeah. So maybe I should summarize some more questions, because a lot of the questions in our chat are dealing with the issue of Iran. How will the new administration deal with JCPOA agreement? Will it be renewed? How will a new Biden administration deal with? Another question. Yes, maybe we should use this question to close the issue of Iran. Do somebody like to answer or to speculate on the issue of the JCPOA? Adam, yes, please.
I would agree with both what Omar and Rima have said about Iran. The only thing that I would just add to what they've said, which relates to this question, I think, is China's relationship, both with Iran, but perhaps more importantly, China's relationship with the Gulf states. Because what we can see in the last year or so, perhaps a little bit longer than a year, is I think this kind of tension of the US being in a state of relative decline globally, but also regionally, and the importance of China and East Asia for the oil exports of the Gulf has meant that China has been really, in many different ways, beyond just the question of oil, has been building very close relationships with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE. And I think it's interesting to throw into this mix about what does this mean for Iran and the regional politics, is that because of Iran's centrality to China's relationships in the Middle East as a whole, it's possible, I think, we might see a somewhat of a softening in the Gulf, a move towards, if you like, what Omar just described as being a war by other means, rather than necessarily a direct military confrontation with Iran, to these other kinds of weakening or rivalries between Iran and the Gulf, perhaps as an impact of this closer relationship between China and the Gulf states. So I think this is something else we need to think about when we're speculating how this relationship might evolve.
Yeah, thank you really so much, Adam. Maybe we should include at once another question raised in the chat and complement the issue of Iran with Saudi Arabia. What is your outlook for Saudi Arabia's chosen path to modernization and less dependence on oil? Adam, do you like to?
Yeah, I can say a few things.
Yeah,
yes. I think it's really important to see. I mean, this has been raised, I think, even more given the COVID pandemic and the significant decline in oil prices that took place from March onwards. But I think it's evident that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states are trying to speed up their efforts at diversification. And I think it's important to consider the ways that these states have interests in non-oil sectors globally, but also regionally. So, for example, interests in the financial and banking sectors, retail sectors, manufacturing across the region. So I think this kind of a stereotype we have of the Gulf as being basically an oil spigot, a giant oil spigot, is quite misleading when we look at their other economic activities. And you can see this has been a priority of the vision documents in Saudi Arabia and also in the other states. So, however, having said that, I think obviously the hydrocarbon economy remains absolutely pivotal to the development of these states, and I don't think there's any. We're not going to see the end of that prioritization of oil anytime soon in the Gulf. But I do think it's important to recognize that the Gulf states really do have significant agribusiness sectors, financial sectors, manufacturing sectors, retail sectors. They're investing in renewable technology, renewable energy alongside their hydrocarbon activities. So we really do need to broaden out the way we think about the political economy of the Gulf in that respect.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, really, thank you so much for this absolutely clear answer to the question raised in our chat. I think we should include, and I'm very sorry for that, we are not able to include all of the questions raised in the chat, but let me read the last one. How do you expect that the proxy war in Yemen might be influenced for the better? Yes, I think, Adam, you raised in your first input the issue of Yemen and the prospect of I don't know how to call it, a situation that might lead to a better environment for the Yemenis due to the US new administration. Can you please go a little bit further into that detail?
I mean, as I think Rima mentioned that, around arms sales to Saudi Arabia, Biden has made some critical comments around that. Now, I'm skeptical that we're really going to see any significant change in international arms sales to the Gulf. You know, it's not just the US, it's also UK and France and other European powers who sell a lot of weapons and military technologies to the region. So I think that will continue in some form, unfortunately. But we may see a reassessment on behalf of the Biden administration that the war in Yemen, you know, is not, needs to be brought to some kind of resolution. That's certainly a possibility. But again, to echo this idea of war by other means, and not just in the case of sanctions, but I think reconstruction is something we need to think about here. You know, in post-conflict scenarios in somewhere like Yemen, given the fact that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have taken a dominant position, not simply in terms of waging the war, but also in terms of different kinds of logistics networks, humanitarian networks into the country, control over ports and other infrastructure networks, and of course wielding important you know, development agencies and aid agencies, that we might see kind of a reassertion of both, or a continued assertion of UAE and Saudi interests in Yemen, but through these other routes, through this post-conflict reconstruction. So I think, again, we need to look at conflict and war just beyond simply the military and physical manifestations.
Yeah, by including the different levels of warfare, economic warfare, and other forms of warfare as well. So I think I've read in the chat another question regarding especially identity politics and the limitations, Omar, you have already raised, the limitations of different social movements, protests, uprisings, and the issue of so-called cross-sectarian dimension of the uprisings, be they in Iraq or be they in Lebanon. Would you agree, Rima, that these limitations are currently necessary ones, in the sense of, given the very general conditions, especially protest movements in Lebanon are confronted with, a TAIF system for more than 30 years, an institutionalized system, power blocks that definitely do need this kind of identity politics, institutionally as well as politically, socially, economically. So are these current limitations in that sense, and the way how to break through identity politics might be a quite difficult one?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Actually, I'm not very sure I would describe the uprisings as being, you know, anti-sectarian, or even, I mean, I would describe any mobilization in Lebanon, but also I think political power in Lebanon and like the alliances between the oligarchs and politicians, they've always been cross-sectarian. So I think, and also I think the other side of the coin, and one of the main, you know, slippery slopes in looking at Lebanon is thinking of, you know, this question of a national identity in opposition to sectarianism. I don't think they're opposites. And I think, you know, the fact that people were whether in Lebanon or in Iraq, I mean, you know, holding a Lebanese flag or holding an Iraqi flag does not necessarily mean, I don't think people were necessarily saying that they are anti-sectarian, cross-sectarian, or maybe this is what they were trying to express somehow, but it doesn't really mean, and I would not take this as a measurement of a transformation at that level, specifically because I think of sectarianism beyond just identity. And it really, I mean, this is really a system that has a clear political economy and a structure that is, you know, that goes beyond expressing those identities. And we've seen historically how, for example, Lebanese nationalism has been linked with some kind of sectarianism that on the Christian side. So I'm a bit wary with jumping to conclusions here. It's clear that there's a transformation, and this transformation is to do with the drying up, the financial crisis, and the drying up of the clientelistic networks, or at least how much they can offer, which was seen, and I think the uprising in Lebanon was described as an uprising and a revolution, and people in the street in the first hour were already saying the word revolution. And if we look at who mobilized at the beginning, it's really the usual constituency of sectarian political parties in Lebanon. So the fact that, things then changed 3 days later, things changed, but I think this initial moment is the break. And the break here is, how can those movements, fight or dismantle a system, that is very much like it's a mafia system somehow, that has its own political economy that is parallel to a state that flourishes on the weakness of any kind of services from the state or state institutions. And that uses the state for its sectarian politics. So, and I think it's very similar in Iraq as well, where we've seen people say, in Iraq, the main slogan of the mobilization was "Nrid Watan," or we want a country or a nation. And it's actually to reflect this idea of, the absence of a state that is able to redistribute, that is able to provide for its citizenry, etc. And I think these are the questions we're grappling with. And in Lebanon, it was really an uprising that came. It's probably one of the if we compare with other uprisings in the region, it's one where the economic factor is clear and direct. There was a financial collapse that led people to mobilize because of, the cherry on top was that tax on WhatsApp. But it's clearly from the very beginning, there was a clear class dimension, and people were clearly saying us versus them. People have attacked banks and bankers. So I think this needs to be understood within the sectarian power dynamics in the country, that in itself is also shaped by the political economy of sectarianism. And and I think in Lebanon, in my recent work, I describe the situation. I think it's sectarian neoliberalism, and I think it's an uprising against sectarian neoliberalism as a structure and a system, rather than just an identity politics mobilization. And again, because we've seen that a lot of the huge numbers that mobilized in the streets, they have also changed their position later on, and the dynamics of how things are unfolding takes us back to an analysis of where people fall on this grid of clientelism and the networks of non-state welfare that are very much disturbed by the financial crisis itself.
Rima, thank you really so much for giving us a clear insight into the combination or the linkage between structural factors, neoliberal policies, and what can be done and has already been done in organizing protests and fighting for very fundamental social as well as economic rights for the people. Unfortunately, I think we are already running out of time, and my colleague already told me that we should now conclude with our wonderful event. In that sense, thank you really so much, Adam. Thank you so much, Rima and Omar, for your wonderful contributions. And for sure, we could raise some points, and that would be great to further continue and to further elaborate on, but unfortunately it is already too late to continue this discussion now, but for sure in the future, in one of VIDC's events that will take place in the coming months and maybe years as well. So really, thank you really so much, and thanks to all of you, our audience, for raising wonderful questions. And I'm very sorry that we could not include all of them, but nevertheless, I hope you could enjoy our webinar on an empire in crisis and possibilities of different social movements, revolts in the Arab world as well. And it would be absolutely great if you could use the link now provided in the chat for your feedback. So please send us your feedback, and that's always a wonderful way for us to think about how to adapt the next events. So once again, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. Thank you, Adam, Rima, and Omar, for your wonderful contributions, and all the best. Take care. Goodbye.